So hi guys, it's Alex here, and in today's video we're going to talk about the somewhat rare but actually quite an interesting line, the so-called Ulvestad variation. So let's put it on the board first. So it follows the moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to c4, and here we're continuing our coverage of the two knights defense, knight f6. Now with this move knight g5, it's a knight attack on the pawn on f7. And in the last video, for those of you who checked it out, and if you haven't checked it out, I would recommend that you do so, we played d5, and after e takes d5, we talked about why taking this pawn on d5 is not such a great idea. We also previously mentioned that knight a5 is the main line for black here. But in today's video, we're going to talk about a different move altogether, and that is the crazy looking move pawn to b5. Which ignores this pawn and in fact offers a second pawn. So the reason why I think this is a great choice at the club level is because at the club level, what white does most of the time is the move that is most natural, which is to simply capture the pawn on b5 with the bishop. Now the idea is seen after black recaptures queen takes d5 and now has an attack on the bishop on b5 and also on the pawn on g2. And as it turns out, this position is already probably quite good for black. Maybe with best play, it's something like equal. The way that the game typically continues here is with the move either bishop takes knight or with the move knight to c3. In the case of knight c3, black actually just takes this pawn on g2. And after queen f3, black exchanges the queens and now simply defends this knight on c6 with the move bishop to d7. Notice white cannot capture on c6, capture back and then take this pawn on e5 because if he did so, the rook would be hanging on h1. So if we do a material count, we can see that each side has the same amount of material, 6 pawns each, but black has a nice situation in the center. So by no means is black worse. And if anything, I would actually prefer to have the black pieces here. So this is one of the options. Now, if instead of knight c3, white here plays bishop takes c6, then this is also not a problem for black. After queen takes c6, we notice that for now, it's true that that white has an extra pawn, but he still has to deal with this attack against g2. If white goes queen f3 here, black can play pawn to e4. Now white should go queen to b3, not only defending on c2, but also striking at the pawn on f7. And it looks as though black might have to go on the defensive with some move like queen d7, which would give white enough time to castle and be quite safe here. But in fact, black has a really clever move here, and that is the move pawn to h6. Striking at the knight and ignoring the threat against the f7 pawn. If white plays queen takes f7 check, the problem is that after king to d8, the knight is still attacked. It can only retreat, if you take a look, it can only retreat to h3. And black here would take the knight, and after pawn takes, black has a strong x-ray on this rook and could actually play e3 with a discovered attack on the rook. And we see white's terrible lack of development on this open board, a very vulnerable king. In fact, black is just winning in this position. White's position is just falling apart here. So therefore, white does not take the pawn with his queen. So let's get back to that position. And now white instead should take with the knight. But after knight takes f7, black has the move bishop to e6 with a double attack on the knight and the queen. Knight e5 is the only move that prevents the loss of a piece because it hits black's queen. But after bishop takes queen, knight takes queen, bishop takes pawn on c2, we have this unclear position where black, it is true, he is still down a pawn, but on the other hand, black has the bishop pair, has a nice lead in development, white has this backward pawn on d2. Black is the only side that has the light squared bishop, and so he can really dominate on the light squares. So overall, the position is unclear, but certainly not worse for black. And in fact, I can say with honesty that if I could play one side or another, I would prefer to play with the black pieces here. So overall, this really is not a very good idea to capture this pawn on b5. So let's go back to that key position in the beginning. So we're back at the sort of critical starting position. Black has just played the move pawn to b5, and we've just seen why bishop takes b5, the natural move, is not so good for white. The next, maybe obvious choice is to take the knight on c6. We're not going to cover this position other than to say that after pawn takes bishop, black will have the bishop pair, and even though his structure may seem a little bit shattered, in fact, the combination of factors, the knight here on g5 being vulnerable to attack, the pawn on c6 potentially being easy to scoop, and the fact that black has the bishop pair, not to mention the better situation in the center of the board for black, means that black has absolutely full compensation for the temporary pawn that he has sacrificed, which is right here on c6. So this should also not concern us. So the good news for any player who wishes to play the Ulvestad is that the two most popular options, bishop takes b5 and pawn takes knight, actually give black a very good game, equality. However, it turns out that the Ulvestad is not popular at the master level because of one move that is not easy to find if you don't know it. The move is bishop to f1, and the point is that you defend the pawn on g2. You anticipate that black would take the pawn on d5. Now, if black does take the pawn, the idea is that white will now play knight c3, hitting the queen and hitting the pawn, and on the next move, let's say black goes queen to c5, white will now return with the bishop, take on b5, and we see that this is a very different situation because the bishop is defended by the knight and the black queen is not threatening to take on g2. So this position is not very good for black. Now, let's go back. In this position here, because taking the pawn is not a very good idea, and of course if black takes with the knight, then in this case white could take on b5, and black cannot take this knight because white has the threat against the knight on c6 as well. So black also should not take with the knight. So what does black do? If queen takes pawn and knight takes pawn, neither of these moves are appealing. What black actually plays is knight to d4, defending the pawn on b5. Now white here will usually continue with pawn to c3, and this is what I recommend. And after this, black does not want to move his knight because the pawn will fall with a check. So now black leverages the fact that the knight on g5 is undefended. Black here plays knight takes d5. Here, what I recommend as white is to just take the knight on d4 and force black into playing queen takes g5 and now take the pawn on b5 with check. Black does not want to play bishop d7 because the bishop, as we'll see very soon, is a very important piece for black to keep. So instead he plays the move king to d8. But this is an achievement for white because now the black king is not ideally placed. It has lost its right to castle. After king d8, white now castles, or he could begin with the move queen f3. We will see that it will get to the same position. White now castles, and black plays the move bishop to b7. White must be very careful here because notice the queen and the bishop are coordinating against a g2. And all that black needs to do is move this knight, even perhaps to squares like f4 or e3, from which the pawn on g2 would also be attacked, or even a square like knight to c3, which would hit the queen and create this double threat. So white must be very, very careful. And what he should do is he should play the move queen to f3. With this move, he is protecting the square, and now if black were to move the knight, let's say to f4, the bishop would be captured and black would have nothing here. So what does black do? Well, he tries to prepare a move like knight f4, and he plays the move rook to b8, defending the bishop on b7. Now, white can actually bravely continue to capture this pawn, and now black, at first sight, maybe the move that at least feels like the most natural move to me, would be the move knight to f4. But it turns out that white could just go queen to g3, and there is no fork here on e2 because the bishop on b5 is covering the square. So after knight f4, queen g3 just covers everything, and black is not in time to take this pawn because his queen is under fire. So therefore the black player had to come up with an ingenious move, and the best move here for black is, I think, a very beautiful move. It's the move knight to e3 instead. The idea is that it's not relevant for black that his knight is en prise so many different times, because if white takes with the pawn, black will win the white queen, and if white takes with the queen, then black has checkmate on g2. So the idea between being here, or the key difference, is that if white now plays queen g3, black will exchange the queens, and then he will collect this rook on f1, and he will have a very good position. However, white, after this move knight e3, can benefit from a key difference between e3 and f4, which is that from f4, the black knight had the disadvantage of not hitting the rook, but it had the advantage of defending or covering the h3 square. So we'll see how white uses this. White plays the move queen to h3 now. So now black has two problems to deal with. One is the threat of checkmate, and now the fact that indeed this knight is en prise and white is prepared to capture it. So the best move for black is queen takes g2 with check, queen takes g2, knight takes g2, and in this position white simply continues his development and his control of the center with the move pawn to d4. Now, there are some weak light squares around the white king, which makes sense because white has just lost his key light squared pawn. You see that f2 and h2 are both on dark squares. So black could get some activity, some compensation, if only he could play the move knight h4 with the threat of knight f3 check. However, with the king on d8, white has the move bishop g5 check, and on the next move, white could eliminate this strong knight on h4. Therefore, black prepares this with the move bishop e7, but white goes back with the bishop to e2 to cover the light squares, and after knight h4, now white plays rook d1, and in this position the f3 square is covered. This is where our line ends. These are basically best moves for both sides, and if we now take stock of this position, we can see that white is up a pawn, and yes, it's true that white's structure on the king side is a little bit weak, but at the end of the day, it's an extra central pawn, and it is a significant advantage for white, and this is why, in my opinion at least, why the Ulvestad variation is not so popular at the higher levels. But we're on move 17 here, and let's face it, most of your opponents will not have done this level of homework. So for those of you from the black side who want to play something adventurous, the Ulvestad, I can tell you, I recommend it to my own students. I can tell you that it's a very, very good line up to quite a high level, up to a very high level, I would say. Finally, if you're not going to play it from the black side, but you're going to play it from the white side, try and remember this critical move, the counterintuitive retreat of the bishop to f1. It's worth knowing in case anybody tries to surprise you with this b5 move. So that's it from me for this video. I hope to see you in the next one, where we'll be addressing the main line of the knight attack decisions after knight g5, which is the Palerio defense with knight a5. So see you then.